I was looking forward to giving this talk in person, but certain geopolitical events have demonstrated that travel to the US at this time is unwise. Even if I ignore the threats the sitting president of the United States has made and continues to make to the sovereignty of my country, the recent conduct by CBP and ICE only further cement that it isn't worth the risk. As such, the organizers of IAC have graciously arranged to distribute this pre-recorded video instead. Note that this talk goes a little over my time slot, but I figure that's okay because I'm no longer keeping you from lunch. I'm here to argue that information architecture both can and should play a more essential role in organizations, particularly as we shift focus to a post-industrial and thus information-centric economy. This holds whether it's being carried out by people whose job title is information architect or not. When I say information architecture, while I do mean the structuring of information, I don't relegate this to the narrow role that's been whittled down and emaciated by a decade and a half of UX supremacy. The first time I encountered information architecture was at my first web design job in the dot-com era. At the time, it just seemed like an obvious and necessary part of the job. Nothing really remarkable about it. When I first really got jazzed about information architecture, though, about 5 years later, user experience design was just another term floating around, trying to get currency, if that. It seemed very clear at the time what information architecture was. Namely, it was the declarative counterpart to interaction design, itself being procedural. That is to say, interaction design was concerned with processes, while information architecture was concerned with structures. There's a duality to this relationship, a sort of recursivity. Every structure was necessarily created by a process. Every process necessarily has a structure. 20 years ago, these ideas were emphatically not relegated to software or software-driven systems. I still regret to this day not being able to attend IDEA 2006 as I had started a new job that week. But its headliner was the guy who designed the wayfinding system for the US National Park System. That is to say, physical signs and paper maps. And he was probably one of the most straight-laced people there. Nearly everybody else on the roster was some kind of artist or artist adjacent. Seriously, go dig the talks out of the archive and listen to them. Not a single one of them was practical in the conventional sense. There's not a single mention of how to do a card sort or a taxonomy, tag library or something like that. Nevertheless, each speaker was super insightful and valuable, and they all considered what they were doing to be information architecture. When I think about that energy, it makes me feel like acquiescing to user experience design as the superordinating umbrella concept for what we do was a mistake. That said, I understand why it was done, and it certainly seemed like a good idea at the time. But in hindsight, I believe this strategic move to bundle ourselves under UX cost us a lot. I think it was Kat King recently who said, if you search LinkedIn for information architect, what comes back is UX designer. I tried this myself, and this is in fact the case. It's actually worse than that, though, because what comes back are Slashies. UI/UX designer, still, in 2025. I don't have to explain to a room full of people who structure taxonomies of concepts for a living the significance of this, but I think it actually encapsulates the power of information architecture. By making information architecture a synonym of UI/UX design, you functionally erase the concept from the lexicon. In fact, the slash itself is really telling, because what it says is that the median check cutter does not perceive enough of a distinction between UI and UX, or at least doesn't value them enough to make them two separate roles. And furthermore, there's enough people on the other side of that proposition to oblige them. Given this situation, wither information architecture. This talk, however, is not a nostalgic lament, but an exhortation to the community. I see information architecture as so much more than just a vestigial appendage of UX design, which itself has been sequestered and de-skilled and segmented. So now what used to be firmly in the wheelhouse of UX is now product. So this talk is about contemplating how we once again make information architecture a sovereign concept, for lack of a better term, in the minds of business managers. I should remark at this point that I do not have a background in library science, nor do I have a background in HCI. Rather, my background is learn whatever I need to learn to get the results I want to get. As such, information architecture to me has always been a broad and abstract concept that nevertheless cashes out in concrete ways. Semiotics plus topology is how I tend to define it, and I consider that succinct definition to be both necessary and sufficient. Indeed, overprescribing methods, work product, and even academic pedigree is what I suspect has contributed heavily to the sidelining of IA over the past decade and change. When you define IA by work products such as website nav bars and product taxonomies, it turns out rarely to be a big enough job to pay somebody full-time to do. I've also talked methodology over the years with other practitioners, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that I favor a more mathematical approach while others lean anthropological. My most extreme interlocutors didn't see the math as important enough to care about and interpreted what I was saying was that their ethnography wasn't important. This is of course nonsense because you clearly need both. Obviously, if you have a bunch of signs or symbols or terminology that isn't grounded in concepts your audience understands, you're going to create a structure that nobody can use. However, if the structure you're creating is no more sophisticated than a list or perhaps a tree, you're not only limiting the places you can be useful, but you're probably trying to fit these structures into places they don't belong. All of this so far has been a mise en place for a strategy for reinvigorating information architecture as a robust and importantly distinct role in the post-industrial sector of the economy and beyond. The goal here is to associate information architecture specifically, not with methods or artifacts or degree programs, but with outcomes. What we want is for the people who sign the checks to understand enough about what their situations are to say, what we need here is an information architect. This is important because, like it or not, your role is defined by the people who pay you. This is why we still have Slashies in 2025. They meet the comprehension level of the people hiring them. Business Bro says, we need a UI designer to make it pop so people want to buy the product. Somebody whispers to him, it's actually called UX now. So Business Bro says, sure, whatever, and thus the UI/UX designer is born. And this is why, despite all the mantras about how design isn't how it looks, but how it works, what actually gets you hired are your Figma screens or whatever. So the challenge here is to create outcomes that are uniquely attributable to IA so that they may be associated with IA. We want people with the money to say, I know what that is, I want that. As an aside, I actually don't think IA is encumbered in the way UI/UX is, so there's a potential advantage there. Like other designerly roles, information architecture mediates between business and technical interests by bringing them together around the goals and needs of the user. We can argue about the extent to which this happens deliberately, but if it didn't happen at all, the endeavor would be pretty short-lived. The problem designers of all kinds face is they get squeezed out of the conversation between business managers and programmers. Okay, this is funny, but we've been doing this song and dance for decades now. Something like, we just need to demonstrate the value of our work so that business leaders will give us a seat at the table. It's kind of a cliche at this point. I think you have to entertain the possibility that they don't actually want you at the table. And the reason why they don't want you at the table is because their agenda is not actually what they say it is. Pavel Samsonov, who made this amusing image, said something really insightful when I talked to him about this situation. He said, you don't need designers if you're running a scam. You just need marketing. So I think that before we can even start talking about solutions, we have to eliminate the possibility that we're being asked to help run a scam. Of course, if you're in this situation, it won't be long before they realize they don't need you, unless you're just there for the optics. This, though, could be its own talk, so we're going to have to bracket it for now. So assuming that you've managed to establish that your boss isn't running a scam and actually genuinely plans to stick around and create a real valuable product, how do you proceed? While the business people are the ones with the money, I think we should start by focusing on our relationship with developers. The reason for this is because I think we can relieve developers of a lot of the work they hate doing. If having an information architect around neutralizes some acute pain points on the part of developers, they will go to their bosses and say, we need IA on our team. This is not a new proposition. Alan Cooper nailed this diagnosis in a talk he made in 2008, or rather, as late as 2008, because he was pretty well rehearsed on this point.
Okay, why interaction designers? Well, because programmers don't respect authority, which is what business executives bring to the party. What they respect is competence. And we are competent.
What does information architecture have to offer developers in particular? Well, for one, we tend to be in charge of at least some of their input data, so we can always make that easier for them. But even better, we can relieve them of a bunch of decisions they would rather not have to make. What should we call this thing? How do these objects relate? How should we structure this data? There are so many of these situations happening on a regular basis in software development, and if you can make a noticeable chunk of them go away, they will love you for it. So what has to happen so this can happen? I think it's the deliverables. We need to make artifacts that developers can consume directly. The most valuable way that you, as an information architect, can transmit your work product to me when I have my developer hat on is in some format that I can just load straight into my stuff and manipulate programmatically. The second most valuable way is something that I can quickly write a script to parse and transform into something that I can load into my software and manipulate programmatically. The least valuable way to send me your work product is something I have to transcribe by hand. Take the venerable spreadsheet. Let's say you, enterprising IA, have gone and made a website navigation, which you deliver in a spreadsheet. Let's say you designate column A for top level sections, which you leave blank in second level sections, which start in column B, and repeat the same pattern for third level sections, which start in C, and so on. Okay, that on its own is a pain in the ass to deal with programmatically relative to just a straight grid of values. That said, it's still in the quick script zone, but only barely. Let's say then that you've also color-coded some of these entries so that they have some meaning that I need to pay attention to. Okay, now this has gone from quick script to I need to start a new side project just to ingest your spreadsheet. It's also going to require me to keep a table of mapping somewhere of what your colors mean. That is, do your job. So fine, let's say you put a legend somewhere in the spreadsheet that contains the mapping so that I can make my script go and read it off from there and apply it. Okay, better not decide to move that because that'll break my script. And then finally, let's imagine that you interrupt this pattern halfway through to plug in a node in cell A65 or whatever. Great. Now I have to add a heuristic that says expect the data to look like this, except maybe sometimes when it doesn't. That heuristic is invariably going to be brittle and it will probably break in consequential ways if you alter the structure any further. So in this scenario, you, information architect, have not saved me, developer, any work. Rather, you have generated quite a great deal of it. I am now maintaining a bespoke one-off parser that interfaces with your particular spreadsheet. So let's say you, who are not an asshole, say to me, okay, I understand all this is burdensome. So why don't you write down a set of guidelines for me and how I'm supposed to enter data into this spreadsheet? To which I say, no, what you're asking for is me to program you like a computer. Okay, that sounds like more work than maintaining just some Baroque parser script, because it's also going to generate more work for you, because people make terrible computers. So you will take longer than you normally would, and you will make mistakes, and I will have to send you go-backs, and we will both get very frustrated with each other. So what I'm trying to say here is that spreadsheet files are designed for direct human consumption from within the spreadsheet program and nowhere else. Or rather, only incidentally are they effective outside the spreadsheet program. But it really depends on the characteristics of the particular spreadsheet. That is to say that spreadsheets are an abysmal format for passing around composite data structures. Furthermore, you can only mimic structures in a spreadsheet that are something other than a flat grid, like the fudging of the hierarchy of the website nav, which I have seen countless times over the years. Again, Makes perfect sense when you're looking at it with your eyeballs, but it sure is hot garbage for parsing with a computer program. And in case anybody's curious about CSV, pretty much the same criticisms apply, except perhaps it's a little better on my side because it won't let you get fancy. Plus, it's a lot lighter weight to parse. Even JSON is better, though, since it can represent nested structures. But even then, you're still relegated to ordered hierarchies. And then there's the matter of naming things within the structure and making sure that's all consistent. Just want to also change the subject here. I have a beef with classification schemes in general. The idea that you can create a set of categories that cover everything in a universe of discourse, such that everything lives in exactly one category, nothing is left out. It strikes me on one hand as quaintly Victorian, but on the other, needlessly barbaric in a world where computers can easily put things in more than one category at once, or even whip up ephemeral categories on the fly and then dissipate them when they're no longer needed. My 2017 talk at what was erstwhile called the IA Summit was about how categories were just one way to make sense of the world, and everything could be represented equivalently through semantic relations because semantic relations are the functional inverse of categories. And what this affords are much richer and more densely connected structures than boring old ordered trees. So how do you make these structures? Boxes and arrows, of course. And there are a lot of tools for drawing box arrow diagrams. Unfortunately, most of them, once again, generate content that's only fit for human consumption and is very costly to extract any useful data out of. A few years ago, I was doing a project with a client to internationalize their entire code base, and I had the team list out all the major user-facing components. There were about 50 of them. And then I had them organize the components in a sort of a phase space, where one dimension represented how complex the component was, and the other dimension represented how valuable it was to the business. So if A was above B, that meant it was more valuable, and if C was to the right of A, that meant it was hairier code. We used Miro for this exercise, just kind of like a virtual sticky note wall. Now, when this exercise was done, I was like, this data would actually be pretty useful for subsequent project planning. And it also turned out that Miro had an API, so it was, at least in theory, possible to extract this data. And sure, all it exposed was the fact that these objects were sticky notes and their XY coordinates and then sort of the text written on them, but that's all I needed. So, in that way, it was a better situation than, say, a straight SVG file or worse, a PDF that only encoded drawing commands and had no data semantics at all. That is, I could write a script that related these objects topologically so they could be subsequently sorted and ranked, re-rendered in various useful ways, maybe even weave that information somehow into the documentation that I was preparing for the client. But that was still a whole thing to go and get an API key, read the docs, knock together an API client, poke around with it until it disgorges the data, and then finally transform that data into something useful. We ultimately didn't have time in the budget to do this and had to abandon it, but in retrospect, I think it probably would have been quicker just to transcribe by hand. What would have been ideal is if the relative rankings were encoded during the exercise so that we could just download the result. That is, if your IA diagrams are supposed to mean something, it would be incredibly powerful if you didn't have to apply human eyeballs to interpret that meaning and you could just feed it straight into a computer. And the last thing I'll say about this example is that we didn't plan to do this exercise, that we kind of came up with it on the spot. And because of that, we didn't budget to extract the data out of it. But even now, in hindsight, I don't know what that data would have been worth. If it was cheap to get it into an appropriate shape, we might have found a use for it. But since it was expensive, we had to leave it on the table. So the problem I'm really trying to highlight here is one of opportunity cost. My last anecdote comes not from my own field experience, but rather a standard. I think it's such a remarkable oversight that I can't not tell you about it. So there's this thing you may or may not have heard of called UML. That is Unified Modeling Language. It's supposed to be this standardized visual grammar and vocabulary for transforming ideas into software. It turns out that the standard never specified an equivalent symbolic representation for UML. That's to say that a UML message was a picture for humans to look at. There's nothing that you could feed into a computer and have it, say, generate stubs for all the code you had to write. This also made it enormously cumbersome to go in the other direction from code to diagram for analysis purposes. And since there was no standard exchange format, you couldn't write UML in one tool and read it off in another, sort of generalized version of an essential problem. What's weird about this situation is that somebody must have designed an ontology somewhere that defined all the bits and pieces of UML and how they interacted with one another. They just never exposed it in any formal way, forcing every UML implementer to roll their own slightly different interpretation. I'm assuming you all know what ontology means, but if you aren't familiar, I would describe an ontology, at least one for our purposes, as a formal specification that denotes a bunch of entities and ways they can relate to each other. The way I sometimes describe it is you could imagine creating an ontology for taxonomies, which could consist of one salient class of entity and 3 semantic relations, broader, narrower, and a sort of non-hierarchically related. You would also include rules that would say things like narrower is the inverse of broader, related is the inverse of itself, that is to say it's symmetrical. And the reason why you would do that is you can feed the ontology into an information system and have it infer that B is a narrower concept than A if the data asserts that something that A is broader than B. This is extremely useful and 100% in the wheelhouse of information architecture. By the way, there is an ontology for taxonomies. No doubt some of you have heard of it. It's called SCOS. Information architecture should figure out how to deliver artifacts that programmers can use directly in their programs, or if not directly, then as close as possible to it. In concrete terms, this means growing beyond spreadsheets, drawing data diagrams with embedded semantics, and going from creating taxonomies to creating ontologies. There's another self-interested reason for doing this. Because if you deliver an IA artifact to a developer and they have to transcribe it before they can use it, you give up your status as the source of truth for the content of that artifact. What I mean by that is that your version is no longer authoritative, their transcribed version is. So if you need to update it, you'll have to go back to the devs and ask them to please retranscribe your new version. At the very least, they're going to resent you for that. Or they might tell you to pound sand. Or they might say, sure, we'll get right on that, and then just never do it. But if on the other hand, you can deliver them an artifact that they can operate over directly, you remain the source of truth, and you can update it all you like because it doesn't cost them any more to assimilate. I think if we figured this out, programmers would not only advocate for us to their bosses, but they would insist on it. The question of the day that all of this business drives toward, no doubt, is couldn't we just AI our work product into a configuration developers could use directly? I think the answer to that question is maybe. It could certainly be a band-aid solution, but the problem, as I'm sure you're probably aware, is that AI makes mistakes. So you would have to be competent enough to evaluate whatever the output format the AI generated so there were no mistakes in it and fix them if there were. Not just the content too, but the syntax. Whereas if you use a deterministic tool, you wouldn't have to bother with any of that because you could safely assume that the output was correct. Just as an aside, since we're on the topic of IA, 2 very prominent things AI developers can use IA for is no doubt some of this got coverage in this conference. One is organizing training data. Training data needs to be organized because you have to know what's in it so the training has the desired effect. Another one that's hot right now is retrieval augmented generation. So RAG is, of course, when a large language model is made to look up anything fact shape in a database as a prophylaxis against making stuff up. Both of these tasks are extremely information architecture shaped. I want to underscore too that I'm not like walking into a room full of professionals and telling them, oh, by the way, you lack the skills to do your job. What I'm saying is you have to understand how your work product gets consumed downstream and how to package it in such a way that saves people time, not generate more work for them. And what this means in my mind is holding your tools to a certain standard. And I can sum up that standard in one word: isomorphism. Isomorphism is a useful concept anyway for information architects to know. In fact, I should hope at least some of you do. If you can transform an artifact you create from one representation to another without losing any information, then those two representations are isomorphic, and the transformation itself is an isomorphism. You know the representations are isomorphic if you can run the transformation backwards and get the same thing as you started with. If you can't do this successfully, then the transformation is what is called lossy, but that may not matter if your application, if you've got the original kicking around. So example here is drawing, say programmatically a picture of a data structure. Now, if you keep the data structure and you throw out the picture, you can always generate another picture for free. If you keep the picture, however, and you throw out the data structure, it's going to cost you something to restore it. And the reason why is you're going to have to inject the missing information back into the transformation process. The same thing happens when you use tools that produce artifacts that don't encode all of the information needed to transform them isomorphically. The missing representation has to be transmitted over a side channel, so that's like you telling me in Slack what the color codes of your mean on your spreadsheet, which generates another artifact that has to be managed and maintained separately. And again, not only does this create more work, but it also guarantees more work in the future, because it makes the transformation process more brittle and liable to break if you change anything upstream. So the ability to round trip your deliverables should be like a non-negotiable capability of the information architect's toolkit. Again, I'm saying you personally do not need to know how to do this. I'm saying your tools should do this for you. And this capability is the difference between more work versus less work for everybody. A little over a decade ago, I tried to estimate the total addressable market for UX, or sort of rather the carrying capacity, so like how many people doing UX design full-time the North American economy had room for. The actual number doesn't matter. I'm sure it's out of date. It was in the tens of thousands. I'm sure it's increased proportionally since. But, the way you estimate something like that goes like you start with a distribution of all the business entities, and in my case it was North America, by operating capital. Then you lop off all the ones that are too small to be able to afford original software and/or digital media development, which is going to be most of them. Then from the rest, you try to estimate a curve, for the dollars spent per year by company. From there, you can say some fraction of the budget is UX writ large. My inclination would be to model the fraction decreasing actually as the overall budget increases, because you're not going to have a 100-person design team. So you can see that assuming within these projects there is a carrying capacity for UX at all, it's something like 80% of the projects will include one such person, and that person will probably be a Slashie. That is UI/UX/visual design/ probably front-end developer too. Moreover, if a project has 2 UX people on it, the second one will probably be a researcher. An eyeball estimate here is that somebody who does information architecture and only information architecture is likely to be at least 4th or 5th on that hypothetical design team. What this means to me is that IA as a subset of UX is inherently relegated to the larger projects and by extension larger organizations, which we know that there are far fewer of. In other words, if you accept the framing that the contribution of information architecture reduces to website navs and product taxonomies, then necessarily only the biggest organizations and/or projects and/or otherwise esoteric and specialized and weird ones are going to be able to afford full-time information architects. So the first step in the strategy I'm proposing for raising the profile of information architecture is for IA to make itself indispensable to developers by relieving them of a bunch of work that they hate doing. We accomplish this by delivering work product that developers can consume with as little hassle as possible. This should have the effect of taking IA out of the design budget, which is always tenuous, and put it in the development budget, which is generally considered to be more essential. It will also create advocates from an organ already considered essential from a business management perspective, that information architecture is just as essential. The second step is to increase the portfolio of outcomes attributable to information architecture, which are of direct value to the business and that don't need to pass through the hands of software developers to be operationalized, but importantly, could be given that treatment if there was additional value to glean that way. This is the organizational cartography I was referring to in the title of the talk. At any rate, both of these approaches are going to need better tools. So organizations are notoriously forgetful things. They forget how to do things, sometimes even what to do in certain situations in the first place. And for the things they do remember, they forget why they do them. And the mechanism for this is straightforward. Organizations are made of people, and people move on. They leave, they get promoted, the organization merges or restructures, etc. And the way organizations remember, or at least one of the ways, one important way, is through documentation. But documentation has failure modes. It goes out of date and/or people just don't bother to read it. And they don't bother to read it because it's hard to find within the organization, it's hard to navigate within the document itself, it's patchy in terms of which parts are current and trustworthy and which parts aren't. Overall, it isn't worth the effort to assimilate. This is a problem that, again, that information architecture is uniquely positioned to solve. So a question that's been plaguing me for about 17 years at this point is like, what would a modern information system look like if you could maximally separate the respective concerns of information architecture and software development? The answer I finally landed on about 2 years ago is an application server I call Intertwingler. It took 15 years of nibbling away at the margins before I got the support I needed finally to carry it over the line. That was back in 2023. But being infrastructure software, Intertwingler itself is not and never will be very much to look at, but I can describe some of its characteristics. The first is that it treats URLs as first-class citizens. That is, it uses a custom resolver that takes the URL allocation completely out of the hands of developers. It also makes it so you don't have to decide up front like where a certain page is going to go, like what its URL is going to be before you can access it. But the main role of the resolver, though, is to eliminate the 404. It does that by creating space to remember what a given URL used to be called should you ever rename it. That is, all redirections and rewrites are automatically taken care of in the core engine. And it remembers the history and so on. That even goes for query parameters and fragment identifiers. The next major thing is that Intertwingler automatically transforms structured data objects into navigable web pages. So this gives you something that will always work, that you can look at and click around, even if it's just naked Times New Roman and blue links. But that can easily be transformed and composed with templates and scripting and CSS. I should also note that Intertwingler embeds semantic metadata into every page, and every page has a variant, which is just the stripped down data. Effectively, this means that every site running on Intertwingler is its own API. And the final characteristic that I want to draw attention to is about Intertwingler proper is its interface to programmers. Every component in Intertwingler is a microservice called a handler. Since the interface is just plain HTTP, developers will eventually be able to write Intertwingler handlers in whatever programming language suits them. Developers only need to write handlers, moreover, for things that Intertwingler doesn't already do. There's furthermore a special kind of handler that's called a transform, which operates directly over the HTTP messages and the message bodies going in and out of Intertwingler, irrespective of their content. It turns out that you can do quite a bit with these in a really small footprint. So things like sanitizing input, resizing images, and rewriting URLs in the markup, adding backlinks, that kind of thing. This part actually reaches back to work I was doing in the early 2000s. So one way to describe Intertwingler to developers is that it's a bus that reverse proxies a bunch of microservices and normalizes them all into a unified address space. If I want to describe it to designers, I would say it's something like it helps you make websites with crazy amounts of links that never break, and it keeps coding to a minimum. So what kinds of applications did I have in mind when I made Intertwingler? Well, for one, pretty much any website I make going forward. All of my own web properties already use Intertwingler's static website generating precursor and are basically waiting for the day that they can be switched over to the real deal. I have to do a bunch of mundane behind the scenes work to sort of beef it out for the open internet, which is probably going to take me the rest of the year, realistically speaking. That said, I work on this thing, between everything else I'm doing, so funding this effort even semi-directly will make it happen much sooner. In the meantime, it's fine for running locally or on high-trust, low-traffic sites like intranets and extranets. As such, I'm targeting Intertwingler's inaugural application for that kind of environment. You might have seen an earlier version of it in my 2023 talk or my 2017 ISOMORPHISM talk. In fact, I started working on this thing all the way back in 2012. But for obscure technical reasons, I wasn't able to move forward on it until I created Intertwingler to function as a substrate. So this is my nascent organizational cartography kit. I am calling it Sense Atlas. And I'm really conceiving it like an interconnected book of maps. And the subjects of these maps are different aspects of your organization. And the purpose of Sense Atlas is to connect all these maps together so that a person can move in and out of them from one map to another and to construct an understanding in their minds of the entire thing. The first aspect I created all those years ago was one for collaboratively mapping out so-called wicked problems, which I use in my consulting practice. The second was taxonomies of concepts. The underlying structure of both Sense Atlas and Intertwingler is a semantic graph, which you can use to represent pretty much anything. Indeed, Sense Atlas barely qualifies as software. It's just a few web templates and CSS and JavaScript that take their instruction from a handful of ontologies. Some of those ontologies are ones I've designed, others are sort of off the shelf. The one that I'm currently working on right now is an extension of said collaborative problem solving into a sort of more concrete project planning and resource management. So you start off with like, okay, how do we solve this problem? And how do we, okay, now we want to put money behind it and people and time and try to figure out, how long it's going to take, that kind of thing. So it brings with it in tow a basic social network analysis capability of people and organizations, like who they work for and how they interact. I found that just in general to be like really useful. This is a client request, by the way, but it suits me that I can eat my own dog food and use Sense Atlas to plan its own development. In the immediate works, I also have provisions for things like web bookmarks, bibliographic records, content inventories, and plain vanilla notes. Website navigations, I'm probably going to take a little longer to do since it's going to be weird to use a website to compose the nav for a website other than itself. Although, you could stage your website in Intertwingler, Sense Atlas, whatever. Same goes for SEO metadata, but that's because I'm going to need to figure out a way to do that I can stomach. But eventually, Sense Atlas will mature into a sort of general purpose semantic graph editor, which can help you edit data that conforms to any set of ontologies. I mix them and match them, including ones that you make. I should remark that both Sense Atlas and Intertwingler are open source, and the data that they operate over is an open standard. That is, you can export 100% of the data in the system as a sort of litany of non-proprietary formats. Of course, the plan is to productize this as soon as is reasonable, but it's important to me that you have access to these capabilities irrespective of your economic relationship to me. I see my role as a service provider in this context as simply facilitating something you could probably, in principle, do by yourself. The software is pretty rough still, but I'll be working this year towards something you can easily install. In the short term, however, you can, of course, get access to this as a byproduct of hiring me. I've argued in this talk that information architecture is uniquely positioned to increase its role as something product teams ask for. Information architects are well positioned to make themselves indispensable to software developers. And with developers as advocates, we can get our unique capabilities in front of management and make ourselves indispensable to them too. The way I suggest doing this is becoming cartographers of their organizations. This will take more powerful tools than spreadsheets. I have shown some such tools in the works. It's time for information architecture to come back out from under the UX umbrella. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Hopefully it'll be in Canada next year.